On tonight's special edition of Politicat, Trump's first 100 days by the numbers.
Oval Office Hours, Professor Peter Slevin gives his take.
Passing grade and U students rate the first 100 days.
And a special Money Minute, look at the Trump economy.
All that and more on Politicat. It's your politics news right now.
Good evening and welcome to Politicat. I'm Fallon Gallagher.
And I'm Andrew Merica.
And we'll be your hosts for this special 100-day special edition of Politicat. Later we'll be joined by guests Owen Brown and Ethan Busby. But first, President Trump's first 100 days by the numbers.
Tonight, 100 isn't the only number we'll be talking about. We'll start this special report by looking at the progress of the Trump presidency through a few other figures. 32. That is the number of executive orders President Trump has signed in his first 100 days. That is more than any other president since Harry Truman in 1945. Before his presidency, Mr. Trump criticized President Obama for overusing executive actions, but he has now signed 11 more than his predecessor had at this time.
507. That's the number of times President Trump has tweeted, averaging just over 5 times per day. His Fridays tend to be the busiest days for tweeting, sending a total of 74 tweets across the 11 Fridays he's had in office. His tweets have ranged from topics from the Civil War to health care legislation. And what's his most popular tweet? An early one on January 22nd when he tweeted, quote, "Peaceful protests are a hallmark of our democracy. Even if I don't always agree, I recognize the rights of our people to express their views."
6 foreign leaders have visited Mr. Trump since his inauguration, including the British Prime Minister, Egyptian President, and Canadian Prime Minister. While the president has yet to visit a foreign country, his first trip abroad will come later this month when he travels to the NATO summit in Brussels, Belgium.
96%, according to a Washington Post ABC News poll conducted in late April. That is the percentage of Trump voters polled who said electing Trump was the right thing to do. Only 2% of voters say they regret supporting him despite relatively low legislature wins Trump has seen in the first 100 days. And now our Tyler Kendall brings us more from someone who knows his presidents. Tyler.
Why do we care so much about the first 100 days? I sat down with Medill professor Peter Slevin to ask him how the count-up came to be.
Well, in some ways it's an artificial construction. I mean, why 100 days? One of the things is the media loves simple frames that give us a way, the media and audiences, a way to understand larger picture issues.
Professor Slevin, the biographer for the book Michelle Obama, A Life, says this marker of 100 days goes back to the time of our 32nd president.
People go back to Franklin Roosevelt and how dramatic his first 100 days were. When you think about what he did, what he was facing with the Depression. People talked a lot about Barack Obama because he was handed 2 wars and a financial crisis. And so it's become just one of those things.
One of those things that's become more prominent now, perhaps, than ever, says Slevin.
Well, I think we see it especially this year because the candidate himself, Donald Trump as candidate, said, here are the things I'm going to do in 100 days. He even said, I'm going to do the following things on day 1. So it was probably inevitable that he would be judged on those 100 days.
And what was President Trump doing on that 100th day? He gave a speech in what was the crucial swing state of Pennsylvania. It was the same night as the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and President Trump was the first commander-in-chief since Ronald Reagan to miss the event.
Thanks, Tyler. Politicat's Caitlin Boudreau talked to Northwestern students earlier today to see how they would grade President Trump's first 100 days.
Northwestern, I'm here at the steps of Deering Library to see how you felt about President Trump's first 100 days in office. How do you feel about President Trump's first 100 days in office?
Wow. That's a loaded question.
I feel like it was a lot of hype.
I don't really have any feelings, to be honest.
I don't think it has actually accomplished very much, despite the sort of braggadocious nature of him, in which he'll say that he has accomplished a great deal.
I'm an international student here at Northwestern. I'm from Greece. So I have been able to keep up with the news kind of from a foreign perspective. And I think that obviously some of his legislation is very harmful, but I'm glad to see that so much protest has been happening and so many people have kind of been attacking him directly.
I'm an independent, so I didn't really pick a side. And like as an independent, it's really kind of interesting to see how like his stuff hasn't passed through Congress.
If you had to give Trump a letter grade for his first 100 days, what would it be?
I would say Trump is the antithesis of someone I would want to be the President of the United States. So pretty much regardless of his actions, we're going to go with a failing grade.
I would give it a C.
An L.
An L?
Yeah.
What's the L for?
For a loss.
My first thought was an F, but then again, like, he's still president, and as we said, Northwestern C's get degrees, so maybe a C-.
And after the break, Money Minute brings us a special report.
President Trump's first 100 days in office. How did he do economically? We'll break it down next in Money Minute.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At his core, President Trump is a businessman, so it's not surprising that many of his campaign promises revolved around the economy. Tonight we have a special Money Minute to assess how he's done on some of those promises.
During the campaign, then-candidate Trump promised a growing economy and more American jobs, what he called the Trump bump. Let's see how the president has done so far. We start with economic growth. The economy grew quite slowly during the first quarter of the year, that's January through March, at a rate of 0.7%. It was actually the slowest quarter of growth since the first quarter of 2014. Economists blame weak consumer spending as the main culprit. The president hopes to bump that growth up to 3% during his time in office. Meanwhile, we saw a 5.2% gain in the S&P 500 during these first 100 days. Just to give you some perspective on that, the S&P 500 gained 8.5% during President Obama's first 100 days. As you'll remember, that was a huge rebound after the global financial crisis of 2007. The S&P lost about 6% during President George W. Bush's first 100 days and gained about 1% during President Clinton's. Now the big one, let's talk about jobs. The president said he created 600,000 new jobs during his first months in office. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says that number is probably more like 300,000 during the months of February and March. Still, that number is pretty good. During their first 2 full months in office, we saw about 1.5 million jobs lost under President Obama, only about 50,000 jobs created under President George W. Bush, and about 200,000 created under President Clinton. Still, President Trump will need to create about 200,000 jobs per month if he wants to reach his long-term goal of 25 million jobs over the next 10 years. With Money Minute, I'm Matt Stunn.
Thanks, Matt. Now here to talk a little bit more about Trump's work at home, Ethan Busby, a PhD candidate at the Political Science Department, focusing on American politics and political psychology. So thanks for joining us, Ethan. So President Trump entered office with a laundry list of goals that he said he would accomplish by the 100th day. Now we're at the 100th day mark. He hasn't quite gotten there. So what would you say is his most important domestic policy thus far?
I'd say that the most important thing domestically speaking that he's done is Neil Gorsuch, so the Supreme Court nominee that was successfully confirmed by the Senate. The reason for that is it's not necessarily a policy per se, but it has large policy implications for the person that sits on that bench and how the Supreme Court rules in the future. There are other things that President Trump would like to do. He certainly has more control over things like executive agencies, cutting funding for different organizations, staffing, that kind of thing. In that sense, he has a lot of influence on policy in the way that he promotes or discourages certain types of policy just by executive agencies alone. So despite the fact that he hasn't done much with regards to legislation, he's had a lot of areas where he can influence policy, and he has through these things like appointments, funding, and agencies.
All right. We saw just earlier in our recap of some of the economic markers of these first 100 days. Growth has slowed, markets are rising modestly, job creation is at a moderate rate. None of this is terrible, but it's not exactly big moves that the president promised for his first 100 days. What does President Trump need to do to kick the economy into gear and to deliver on some of those big moves he promised?
Yeah, that's $1 million question. I wish I knew the answer to. It's something that maybe economists might know better, but these things, there's no clear answer on what needs to be done to make the economy better. I can tell you a little bit about what he might say he needs to do to get the economy back into gear, so to speak. He's going to be talking about things like bringing back jobs, energy-related jobs like coal and oil. He's going to talk a lot about renegotiating trade to the benefit of American workers. Tax cuts so the environment's more business friendly. These are all things that he would say he needs to do to make the economy better. Other people disagree about this. Is this the right way? And so in the end, I don't know that there is one answer. And in fact, many individuals are going to tell you that the president has really no influence on the economy that's measurable for many years. So it's hard to really say what does President Donald Trump need to do. Although, again, those are some things he would certainly mention. He would like to think he has a large influence on the economy, but it's really up for debate how much can he actually do even if he wanted to.
So now, one of the things that he promised a lot on the campaign trail was the repeal and replace of Obamacare. And on day 63, he actually went for it with the ACHA. But it was actually Republican infighting in the Congress that was responsible for the destruction of that. So what do you think is next for health care? You know, we saw rumblings from Republicans on a revised plan making the rounds, but do you think that they're going to try to go for it again?
I think they certainly will. It's too big a part of their platform, too big a part of their promises to do nothing about it. The question is not necessarily are they going to go for it, but are they going to be successful? They certainly show a desire to continue to try for this type of policy reform. And I think they're going to try. They've released a lot of different proposals. They now have a plan that they think will be successful. But the issue they always face is, do they come down to the far right or do they come down more towards the middle? And every time they do this, they're walking a line, and it's difficult for them to determine, we need the right number of votes, so where do we fall? Where is the place where we fall? I think they will try again. I think this is not the end of hearing about it, but I think it's going to be a long road. I think it's going to be a long road before we see any substantial changes just because of the difficulty of navigating how do we get the votes.
All right. Now, the president's government is a bit light on employees. Some 530 government jobs requiring Senate approval still have not been filled. That's out of about 550. So what is going on here? Why is he steering such an empty ship? And what is that going to mean for the government in his next 100 days?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of things that could be at work here, and we can talk about as many of them as you'd like. So the first is that he's faced a lot of opposition in the Senate. Now, they've changed some rules recently, so it's easier for his nominees to be confirmed. But he does face a lot of opposition there from people who wouldn't have opposed appointments from other presidents. However, even despite that, if you look not just at the people who've been confirmed, but just the number of people he's put forward to be appointed, that number is lower than other presidents. And the reason for this, I mean, it's anybody's guess. Maybe he's the only one that knows. But he has explicitly told people, he's explicitly said in Fox News in February that he's fine leaving those jobs open, that they're not filling the jobs because he doesn't want to fill the jobs. Here we have a president that's indicated a number of times that he wants to have a more streamlined, more slim government, both in terms of agencies, in terms of funding, and now it seems also in terms of people who actually run the organizations. To answer your second question about what does this mean for policy, that's trickier. I mean, what it means is executive agencies have less money, they have less people to support them in what things they do, so they have to be more targeted in what they're more strategic in what they do. They have less ability to do things because there's fewer people there. And maybe that's what he wants. Maybe that's what he's going for. Certainly seems to be the case if you look at the things that he funds, at the amount of people he's willing to appoint. Now, it is the case, actually, that his cabinet is larger than other presidents' cabinets. So at least on the level of the high, sort of visible appointments, he has more than other presidents. He's got something like 21 appointments, which is more than other presidents have had in the past. But if you look, actually, at the people who run the agencies, so the undersecretaries, the administrators, that's where we're really missing people. And I think that's where you're going to see implications for how do the agencies actually enact policy? How do they do things?
Well, thanks, Ethan. The president has said that he will put America first, so we'll keep you up to date on domestic issues here at Politicat. Stay tuned.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
President Trump's first 100 days have seen a lot of international news, from his first few days on the phone with world leaders to meetings over cake at Mar-a-Lago. The president has been doing a lot of talking and a lot of learning. After spouting some pretty blunt rhetoric about foreign policy, Trump has had to face negotiations and summits with leaders such as Xi Jinping of China and Justin Trudeau of Canada. And President Trump seemed to back down. Now, foreign policy is one of the areas that the president has the most power and the least oversight. It's also an area where words matter a lot. For more, we welcome Owen Brown, a PhD candidate, also in political science, whose scholarship focuses on international relations and political theory. Owen, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
President Trump seemed to get off to a bit of a rocky start. Less than constructive phone conversations with heads of state, including a shouting match with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. So what does that mean for the Trump administration going forward, and how has he presented himself as a foreign policy negotiator?
Well, I think moving forward, he faces a lot of difficulties. I think a lot of leaders seem somewhat reticent now, but reluctant perhaps to interact with him. I think largely because there's a lot of uncertainty about his policy, what this will mean. There's been a lot of foreign policy blunders. I mean, it began with his telephone call with Taiwan. So I think moving forward, he's just going to face a lot of increased difficulties.
So the president has been very highly critical about NATO, especially on the campaign trail, calling allies to step up their monetary contributions, and a lot of this seemed pretty similar to what we've been hearing about NATO coming from the Kremlin. But since entering the Oval Office, it seems that he's changed his position. So what exactly is his position now? Where do we stand? And what's been the effect on NATO?
Well, I think to begin, it's important to realize that U.S. calls for NATO allies to increase their contributions to NATO has a long history. It's been going on for years, perhaps not with the same sort of vitriolic rhetoric and coupled with these loud threats. But I mean, it's a common occurrence. I think I would caution against sort of putting too much emphasis on that. I think in terms of his position, it's a bit difficult to say what it is. It's very unclear if he actually knows what NATO is and what NATO does. I think we've seen, especially with his regards to collecting debts on NATO, which don't exist. So I think it's difficult to sort of nail down what exactly his position is. I think we'll see his rhetoric, and if we can speak of position, of it softening in the future if NATO allies go in the direction he wants to see them going and if they follow his priorities. If, however, they don't, I think we're likely to see sort of increased calls about NATO's obsolescence.
All right. We've seen, especially recently, an escalation in tensions between the United States and North Korea. The president has made it clear that Barack Obama's doctrine of so-called strategic patience is over. However, yesterday the president announced that he would meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, that he actually wanted to meet with him. So what's the next plan here? Are we seeing a complex international relations maneuver or just flip-flopping? And what do you think the president would be able to accomplish in such a meeting?
Well, I think I'd say that there's probably not much of a plan here. I think that his comments over the past 2 days, first with Kim Jong-un being a smart cookie, and then yesterday with him being honored to meet Kim Jong-un, I think the reaction we saw from the rest of the administration of sort of being surprised and sort of backpedaling and sort of cautioning against what this means, I think suggests that this wasn't part of sort of some larger plan. So I'd say that moving forward, we're likely to sort of see a continuation of this policy of sanctions and increased military tensions. I think should a meeting take place, however unlikely that is, it seems doubtful whether much will actually be accomplished, just because in the past when meetings have taken place, North Korea has received aid, it's backed away from its nuclear ambitions for a few years, but then is fired up its nuclear program once again. So it's doubtful whether Trump, despite claims about being a fantastic negotiator, would actually be able to accomplish much.
So now moving on to international trade, Trump's been highly critical about international trade deals like NAFTA and also the Trans-Pacific Pact. And now it looks like he's going to keep out of the TPP, but his attempt to renegotiate NAFTA was seemingly rebuffed in a phone call with Mexican President Peña Nieto and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So would you say that Trump has hit, let's say, a wall with respect to trade?
Well, I think trade policy is always a very difficult area. I think that it faces a lot of opposition from all sides of the political spectrum for a number of good reasons in some cases. But at the same time, there are also interest groups and corporations, individuals who are heavily invested in free trade, both literally and figuratively. So I think under any situation, getting trade policy through is going to be quite difficult, especially with regards to TPP, that faces broad opposition in a lot of countries. With regards to NAFTA, I think it'll be difficult for him to actually sort of do much on this area. So I think he'll probably just end up seeing more of the sort of the status quo moving forward. I think that trade negotiations haven't really done much over the past many years. So I think it's an open question moving forward.
So we've talked a lot about Trump's international presence in the last 100 days. So how would you say that he's done so far overall? And how do you think he's going to do in, say, the next 100?
Well, I think so far, I would say that it's been pretty much what we could have expected. I think the campaign, we saw a lot of sort of unexpected comments, a lot of uncertainty about what this would be, and I think this is translated into his policy. I think there's a lot of blunders and stumbles and sort of starts and stops. So I think we'll see this moving forward a fair bit. I think, and also in the next 100, I think we'll see what happens with the Brussels NATO summit coming up. NATO just announced that they were going to sort of increase their counterterrorism units, and then Trump, of course, claimed this was due to his policy, although, of course, they were always involved in counterterrorism. So I think in the next 100 days, we'll see sort of much more of the same, unfortunately.
Okay. All right, Owen, thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned after the break for the final word.
And that brings us to tonight's final word.
The views expressed in this segment are not necessarily the views of Northwestern University or NNN, they are the views of the Politicat editorial staff.
President Trump is celebrating 100 days in the Oval Office, but this past weekend's milestone isn't solely his own. It's also a marker for us, the press.
Journalists at organizations ranging from the New York Times to BuzzFeed News to Fox News and, of course, Politicat have been covering the Trump presidency now for 100 days.
But really, we've been covering Donald Trump for much longer. It's been close to 600 days since he launched his campaign, and that coverage is partially why we're here now at day 103.
Some say the 2016 presidential election broke journalism. First, the media didn't take Trump seriously. Then the media became submissive, breaking into scheduled programming to broadcast nearly all of his rallies, letting him phone in to Sunday morning shows, broadcasting nearly every single tweet.
But while we in the media were running in circles chasing whatever breaking news detail we could find, the American people were looking at the big picture, at a man with a message that we failed to see and account for, which is why so many of us got Election Day so wrong.
The president continues to attack the press, calling us fake news and an enemy of the people. And while these accusations are counterproductive in a democracy, it's not hard to see how, after our election fiasco, many people believe them.
As the attacks on the media from the White House grow stronger, we feel the need to prove to the American people that we are as vital to freedom of our nation as we say we are. But we can't do that if we fall into the same traps that got us here in the first place.
In all of this scraping for the next lead, we've lost our voices. we've lost our ability to speak up, to question, to push back some of the most fundamental tenets of responsible journalism.
Margaret Sullivan, a media columnist for the Washington Post, gave the media a grade for its reporting. It was a D, which wouldn't pass a class at Northwestern.
Since January 20th, though, we have shown some improvement. The Washington Post published a piece revealing former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn's connection to Russia. The New York Times revealed an in-depth look at the significant number of former lobbyists appointed to the two positions in the federal bureaucracy, and almost all organizations are fact-checking better than ever.
But we still haven't aced our coverage of President Trump. TV news analyst Andrew Tyndall says that we fall victim to the, quote, shiny object syndrome. We're trapped in the 24-hour news cycle and we only pay attention to novelty. We've lost sight of what matters. Our reporting often lacks context and nuance.
In other words, we don't scrutinize. We sensationalize, then normalize, then move on.
The Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics states that journalists must abide by 4 basic tenets. We must minimize harm, we must act independently, we must be accountable and transparent.
But most importantly, and at the top of that list, we must seek truth and report it.
Not tweets, not sound bites, not, did you hear what Trump said today? Truth.
We're only 100 days into this administration, and there are hundreds of days ahead. Let's not lose sight of what we're doing here.
The American people depend on it.
All right, Owen, we have a little bit of time left here tonight.
Sure.
So do you have any thoughts on the media?
Not a whole lot.
Just in general?
Um,
How did we do the first 100 days?
Well, I think the media has a really important role to play in sort of holding the government accountable. I think at the same time, it's not important to overlook that the role of the media has played in sort of fomenting vitriol and sort of spreading sort of fake news and stuff like that. Of course, not all organizations are going to be responsible for this. But I think like we have to sort of figure out a way for the media to play a productive role. And I think it's important to sort of hold the president to account, but and also sort of perhaps not be shy about sort of expressing opinions about sort of things that might be problematic or things that might be sort of dangerous precedents to set. So I think that sometimes this sort of tendency towards sort of absolute neutrality can sometimes take away, perhaps. So it doesn't mean sort of like going too far down the other road, as we've seen that how that can lead to problems. So I think like finding that balance and not being afraid to sort of speak out when things need to be spoken out against.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That will do it tonight. Thanks to our guests, Ethan Busby and Owen Brown. For Politicat, I'm Andrew Merica.
And I'm Fallon Gallagher. Thanks for watching this special edition of Politicat. Good night.